Hello, and welcome to the Total Mental Performance Podcast, the one and only mindset podcast dedicated to helping fitness entrepreneurs and coaches master their mindset, giving you insider access to industry leaders around their psychology, their campfire stories, and the mindset required to be successful in this business. I'm your host, Kyran O'Neill, mental performance coach and founder of Total Mental Performance, the world's fastest growing specialist mindset service dedicated to the fitness industry. So, without further ado, let's lean in and listen. Yes, team. Welcome to another episode of the Total Mental Performance Podcast. Today we have MJ Lennon. I got introduced to, known as Lenny, through our friend Ben Heron. And Ben, as you probably all know, he's been on the podcast. Lovely guy. When he says, Kyran, you need to meet this guy, ask him about his story, I always jump on. So Lenny, he's the founder of the ECA Academy, a specialist trainings academy for personal trainers. He's a serial fitness entrepreneur, whether that's with gyms, events, training, education, consultancy. And also, as I've just found out, this is our first ever conversation, he's also got a boxing background, which I always connect with boxers with our joint backgrounds. So, Lenny, mate, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Kyran, thank you for having me here, man. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. And yes, you're right, Ben is an absolute legend. Absolute great guy. I know Ben a long time. Yeah, we go back a long time. We kind of started out in the fitness industry around about the same time. And he's always done amazing things. And likewise, when he said to me, I've got to introduce you, because I actually met Ben. I know you guys live with each other out in Dubai. When I was out there, he's like, oh, you got to meet my friend Kyran. So yeah, this has been a long time coming, and I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to share with your community, and they're very much lucky to have you, dude.
100%, much appreciated. And yes, Ben has an absolute, when you meet an operator with an absolute heart of gold, it's just amazing to see. But mate, if you give some of your story, how did you actually get into the fitness industry? Where did it all start?
So you mentioned our boxing background, which is cool. I always love talking to fighters. I think they're the nicest people in the world. Guys in any combat sport, I just genuinely do think they're the nicest people in the world. And I think a part of that is because they've got nothing to prove. So I come from a boxing background, and when I was around about 18, 19, 20, I stopped fighting as frequently as you do. There was other things going on. I wanted to earn money. I knew I was never going to turn professional because I just wasn't good enough, truth be told. And I wanted to keep my faculties. I was like, there's easier ways to earn money. So I started thinking about that, and I actually started working for my father whenever I left school. So my father owned a pub in Belfast city centre, and I went straight into working there. Now you can imagine a pub in Belfast city centre. It's a crash course in human nature, right? It is an absolute crash course. So yeah, I started working there, and I knew I wasn't going to do it the rest of my life. It was just a kind of stepping stone. It was like, right, how do I figure out what I'm doing with my life? Because I had no idea. By the way, I left school with nothing, like zero qualifications. I hear people say this and then they throw out one or two. I left with nothing. I couldn't wait to get out of the place. I absolutely hated school. Like, you wouldn't believe the thoughts of just sitting at a desk all day and taking orders just drove me crazy. So I left, and then I went to work for my father, and then I was still boxing at the time, but my boxing career I knew was going to slowly come to an end. So I was like, how do I stay in the game? So I started trying to figure out ways of, well, number one, I was always making weight. You know what that's like yourself here. And we had a conversation just off camera. It is the worst part of being a fighter. And I always felt like physically drained and really thin, and I just never really felt strong. So I started to figure out, well, what are the ways that I could still move well, but also try to get stronger? And for some reason, I didn't really take up bodybuilding much. I know a lot of the time, whenever guys become teenagers, they generally think, oh, okay, bodybuilding is the way to go if I want to put on size. I actually started training with kettlebells first. So there's a guy in Belfast. His name's Paul McElroy, and I actually knew him from my boxing background. Me and Paul, we actually fought as amateur boxers, and he was a great athlete as well and a great coach. So he had started coaching people, and he started to use kettlebells, and kettlebells were largely unheard of. I'm giving away my age here, but they were largely unheard of. They were in very few gyms. So I was like, oh, this here's interesting. I want to learn a little bit more about this. So at the time, Paul was studying under a man named Pavel Satsulin, and Pavel was basically responsible. If anyone is familiar with Pavel, he's basically responsible for bringing kettlebells into Western society. So he was the man who first popularized it in America. And you generally find that whenever things become popularized in America, they start to make their way east again, and then they end up in sort of Western Europe and things like this. So that's generally what happened. So I started training more and more with kettlebells, and I was like, oh, I like this. I think I could become better at this. So then I went and took Pavel's certification, which is the Strong First certification. And then I started coaching people in boxing and using kettlebells. And that's generally where my career that's generally what brought me into the fitness industry. Now I actually still had quite a few fights right up until I was like 24. And then I got married, and my wife was like, dude, you're getting too old for this here, carry on, like no more. Because I was doing it for fun. Yeah, I wasn't bringing no money in for it. And I was like, right, okay, you're right. Fitness is bringing money in at this stage. So now I'm going to have to focus more of my energy and attention on that.
I hear you. I totally hear you. And it's funny because whenever I talk to boxers, like you said, it's like they've got nothing to prove anymore. The ones that aren't fighting anyway, most ones that are fighting feel like they have something to prove, which is why they're getting in a scrap and is why they're putting on a show.
So true. So true.
But when you think about just boxing and all of everything that translates over to coaching, because you probably had some incredible boxing coaches, it's more the emotional side that I find with boxing. Of course, you've got to be physically fit. Of course, you've got to know technically how to move your feet, how to move your head, how to throw a punch, how to get out of the way. Strategy, you've got to know, okay, well, if he's in theory, if he's taller and more rangy, you got to get on the inside. But then going up a level, it's like, well, do you have to get on the inside? And can you bring them onto the front foot and then draw them on? You got all of these different attributes, but a lot of it is just dealing with emotion. It's dealing with mindset. It's dealing with a setback, getting your ass kicked in front of quite a few friends and having to dust yourself down and go, all right, I'll try again. How do you find that has set you up for the career that you've built?
So, amazing question, by the way, mate. I absolutely, I loved fighting. I even loved losing. It didn't get to me at all. And I just think that as a coach, you have to be a leader, whether you like it or not. And I think a big part of leadership is doing hard shit, right? It's having difficult conversations. It is, it's being congruent, right? It's all of those things. And I just generally think that whenever you have that sort of background and you're fighting, like, I don't think there's anything more difficult than fighting in front of, I actually boxed in front of 3,000 people in the Odyssey. Like, there's nothing that I could do would be more difficult than that. So for me, having had that background, it becomes so much easier to deal with pretty much any situation. And I was generally a very emotional fighter as well. So, and again, given my sort of background and the first job that I done, I said, as a crash course in human nature and learning how to de-escalate situations. I think those two things combined really helped me personally, as in being willing to do hard shit, but at the same time understanding people and understanding the absolute worst of human nature and trying to bring the best out in people. And I think that's generally what we do as a coach. So yeah, just having that, it honestly, the perspective it gives you is just like next level. At least it is for me anyway. And then having had those experiences with different coaches and understanding how they manage emotions and their different styles of coaching, I just feel very privileged to be able to bring that into my own practice today.
Absolutely. And it's always like the old boys in the gym. I used to have this coach called Harry Goodwin. The guy was in his 80s. He'd actually been in the corner of my dad And I was the last boxer that he ever cornered. He'd been to the Olympics, he'd been to all around the world and whatever. No one had any idea who this guy was. Like, no, it was like he was
Wow.
just this forgotten relic. When he could only make it into the gym maybe like once a week maximum. But he always had a soft spot for me, and he'd always give me time. I'd always ask him, and he even his hands, they were shaking from years, like decades of pads. And even just
Wow.
listening to him and just his view on life and the world, and he couldn't really speak that well either. But the lessons that gets passed down, because if you think about, fighting is one of the oldest sports or if not the oldest sport in history. Two men doing battle, it's incredible.
Mm,
So with him, I
yeah.
remember him, he just said, if you're
I
going to do
don't think there's
anything,
anything
be real.
more difficult than that. I'm just off a competition this weekend as well.
Yeah, but how does your neck feel today? I always find, I know you were doing jiu-jitsu, so I've never done jiu-jitsu, but I know whenever I used to do tournaments or fights, my neck would be the thing that was always really tight. You never
Whiplash.
really use your neck, do you?
Yeah, my neck is absolutely in bits. There's actually a term called jiu-jitsu neck, and I have no doubt developed that. But even like for me, I always say, especially now today, and again, I'm kind of aware of biases, but obviously, I had a boxing background as well. And for me, especially the older I get, I look for ways to de-escalate situations and de-escalate people and just try to calm situations down, right? So I think for me, I always recommend to people, and we're talking about doing hard shit, right? And I know your podcast is set up for trainers and how they manage their own mindset, how they manage their own state, right? So for me, I generally think that things like boxing, jiu-jitsu, combat sports, as you say, they come as natural to us as eating and sleeping, right? Since the dawn of time, we've been doing that. It's hard, it's difficult, it's not an easy task to do. But I generally think that the confidence that gives an individual just goes way beyond anything else you could do. I see a lot of people today and they're doing things like cold water exposure, which is great. It's awesome. And they're saying this is difficult. And it is to a certain extent, but after a while it kind of feels nice. Right? It
Yeah.
feels nice. But there's never a time when you're grappling or when you're standing in a ring striking each other that ever feels nice, even if you're winning. So for me,
Always
that's
coming
way
back.
more difficult than anything anyone could ever do. And I think as a leader, being willing to do difficult things like that, but also for myself, and I suppose just general life, having the ability to de-escalate, because striking someone is escalating a situation. If you're involved in some sort of situation and you strike someone, well then that's gonna heighten the tension. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, you can generally like pin someone down, hold them in a position, and say, "Listen, let's calm this down for a second." And that's generally what I love about the sport. The fact is that I get so much from it in terms of confidence, and it's a really difficult sport. But at the same time, you can also de-escalate a situation and calm things down by using jiu-jitsu. So I actually recommend that everyone does jiu-jitsu. Again, I'm aware that I'm biased about it right now because I'm competing in it and I'm so invested in it. But I generally think, like, if everyone had some sort of background in that, well then they would be more confident within themselves, within their character, within the fact that they're willing to step onto the mats because it's difficult, right? I just think there's so many benefits to it, and you're not getting strikes to the head as well, which is a bonus too.
There's just so much more longevity in the game when you're not taking shots to the head. And you probably have friends, and I
So
have
much more.
friends where they're slurring their words, and then they're, even I
Yeah,
find after hard sparring, I'm more forgetful, or harder for me to concentrate. You can't argue that there is a cognitive performance impact from those sports, but as long as you do it in a controlled environment, good people around you that are overseeing things, you're not going into, like, I mean, I don't know about you, I've walked in some gyms where there's this I'm not going to say the name of the gym, but it was like air quotes Cuban style, like, boxing academy in London,
Right.
And I went in there, and after session one, at the time I was probably about 60 kilos, and I was sparring with somebody that was 79. They're like, yeah, we'll just take it easy. And I was having to really like maneuver my way around the ring, and I was like thinking, what am I doing? Like, how have I ended up in this position? And the guy didn't even hit me that hard, but it cracked one of my ribs. And you got to be careful where you go. But if you find the right coaches, it will just completely change your life and set you up for just like you said, business almost feels easy, because this is something that a lot of coaches don't realize is, in my opinion, there's two halves to coaching. There's coaching, and then there's the business of coaching. And I think the psychology behind the business of coaching is where coaches often get stuck the most when they're trying to set up their own PT brand. If they're trying to set up their own online coaching brand, you've set up 2 gym facilities. That is hard. And I always think fighting and business are 2 of the best personal development tools that you could ever do, because they're so tricky. They're so emotionally tricky. They're such a mental game which comes in behind them, right?
You just absolutely light bulb moment I had there, dude, because I couldn't agree more. And I think there's a lot of things that cross over as well. Like, there's so many things that you could take from your boxing background that I take from jiu-jitsu every single day I go, and I can apply to my business. Like, wow, this is like, even, you talk about great coaches. My jiu-jitsu coach now, it just seems like whenever I speak to him, he has so much knowledge of not only things that happen on the mats, but also off the mats. For example, I asked him a question a few months ago, did he feel under pressure not to get tapped by any of the lower belts? And he just turned around to me and he said, pressure self-inflicted. And that was it. And I was like, it just takes so much humbleness, if that's a word. Humility. Sorry, I should have said it. Just so much humility and knowledge of the world and experience to be able to answer someone in that way. He didn't try to explain it. He didn't try to do anything. He just said, all pressure self-inflicted.
It's just that wisdom, isn't it? And it's that wisdom that hits you to the core. And you're like, yeah, it's so simple. I always say pressure is perception. But then I also say everything is perception. Because if we think about reality has to come through the mind. If we think about everything that's happening in the outside world, is it really happening in the outside world, or is it just happening in our mind? Because it's our mind that has to process the outside world. So once that's all in here, it's like, well, if everything is perception, then it makes sense for me to work on my perception, to understand my perception and take that step back. But when strong emotions come and hit you, it's like that perception is just completely jarred. Strong emotions make us stupid. They cut down our time frames. They cut down our options. And all of a sudden, we're just dealt with what we believe is reality versus it isn't reality. And sometimes just having a coach, like an old wise guy, and they don't even have to be old. Sometimes I've had coaches younger than me that are much more wise and much more experienced, and being able to have the ego to put that aside and go, yeah, well, this person clearly has wisdom, and listening to that. And they'll just say something like, pressure is self-inflicted. Bang, it hits you between the eyes. You're like, oh, wow. Yeah, so true.
And I brought that into work. I'm so glad you brought that line up. I actually read a line a couple of weeks ago, was that proper perspective is the key to persistence.
That's it.
Right? And I was like, and it really struck me at the time, because I was like, well, when people are inconsistent and they lack persistence, it's because they've made an emotional decision based on a lack of perspective of what's going on. And I was like, yes, that is exactly it, though. That's exactly it, man.
Exactly. And obviously, I feel like it's Coach 101 book to read, which is Atomic Habits by James Clear. But one thing that surprised me about that book, a lot of it, I never want to be that guy, like I kind of already knew this, but sometimes when you get a lot of that information, because I'm a trained therapist, cognitive hypnotherapist, NLP practitioner, and peak performance coach. So a lot of it I knew, but I hadn't put it in, when you know a lot of the information, but you don't make that link. And the connection that he made was identity-based habits. And I knew that on an identity level, if you don't feel good enough, you're going to behave in a way which perpetuates that. But when he put it down, like you said, that consistency, that persistence, and understanding that on a deeper emotional, psychological, and identity level. That for me was just so fascinating to bring all of those worlds together and go, well, if you want to get more shit done, emotionally you make a decision on who you are as an individual, and then also whether you want to do that or not. But the problem is, emotions are so blurry, and particularly men as well aren't trained to communicate with their emotions. They're not trained to manage their emotions, and they're not trained to work with limiting beliefs and those different things. So it's quite hard for people to get access to those resources, and I think that's part of what we're doing here at TMP is making the perception of reality cool. We're making therapy interesting from a performance outcome, and that's really what's so fun to have these conversations, because everybody's got their own perception on the way that the world works, the way that the fitness industry works, that coaching works, and it's just a massive dance, which makes it also fun.
Amazing. There are no unique messages, only unique messengers.
Yeah, agreed. All this wisdom's already there.
Yeah, unbelievable.
It's already there.
Unbelievable.
Well, mate, I'd love you to run us through the next part of your journey. I think most fitness coaches, and I'm not a fitness coach, I'm a mental performance coach, but even I have thought about having my own gym, about having my own facility. There is this thing where everybody thinks, yeah, well, if I had my gym, I'd have it like this, and we'd be doing this, and this would be here, and whatever. So I feel like it's a very idyllic pursuit. One of my best friends also launched a gym called 1RM in my hometown. And I saw firsthand how bloody difficult, scary, stressful, how many different angles that comes through, whether that's legal, that's one big thing, insurance, getting trained coaches, getting people to just sit on the front desk, getting the processes, running a shop, selling memberships, making sure payments are coming in, on the gym floor drama. Like there was just so many things. But everyone in their head thinks, well, if I did it, it'd be easy and I'll do it this way. So I'd love to get your just a small part of your story as to how you built that up, and then also the mindset required to do that.
Yeah, of course, man. So whenever I first started coaching, I was actually doing it from my old boxing gym, and very quickly we outgrew it to the point where my coach was like, "Listen, we need this space to coach the fighters. Your shit comes secondary." So I was like, okay, I've got to figure something out here. So at the time, I didn't have the resources to go and open my own facility. This was 11 years ago, and the industry's changed a lot in 11 years, to the point where I would say now, today, it's relatively easy to go and open a facility. This was before anyone came in and done fit outs. There was nothing really, like, unless it was a big commercial gym. Big commercial gyms would have got fit outs done, but smaller micro gyms hadn't really got access to the type of fit outs that we see today in most gyms. So we didn't have the resources, so we just had to get resourceful. So what I actually done was I went to my father, who owned a pub in Belfast city centre, and I said to him, look, can I rent out the top floor from you? And he said, okay. And he charged me 250 quid a month to rent out the top floor, because it was so small. He kind of just thought, well, you're just training a few people up there, whatever it is, away you go. And as I say, we didn't have the resources. So what I had to do was get a few of my friends in who were joiners, and they built us a makeshift pull-up bar, a makeshift squat rack, dips bars. It's just basically a makeshift setup. But it was cool. And me and my business partner, PJ, we jumped in on the work. Like, there was a stud wall down the center of the room, so we went in and knocked it down ourselves, created the space, put down the floor, which was carpet. Like, we were winging it, completely winging it at the time. We had no clue at all what we were doing. We just knew that we had outgrown the boxing gym, so now we had to figure something out. And fitness was what I wanted to do, and I always wanted to own my own facility as well. So for me, this was an absolute no-brainer. I didn't think of the implications from a business perspective or anything like that. I want somewhere to train people and to help people, and that's the only thought process was going through my mind. So we got it done. I have no idea how we got it done, but our clients had to walk through a public bar first of all, up 3 flights of stairs, through a restaurant, past the kitchen, only to get into the facility then. And then we were doing like small group training, and we were doing boxer size classes. And while we didn't know what we were doing from a business perspective, even from a coaching perspective, like I dread to think what we were doing back in the day, because I was just using like old school boxing techniques to train people and to try to get people in shape. But what we did have was a great culture in the place, and that got us by. Like people still talk about it today. 11 years ago, people still come up to me and they're like, "Yeah, do you remember the old gym? Like that was amazing." And like, yeah, it was cool. It was cool for you, but it wasn't so much for us because we had so many headaches to deal with there. But that was the start of the process, and we stayed there for a couple of years. We didn't get planning permission for it. We just opened the facility and decided, well, let's just do this. We'll just figure it out as we go along. If something goes wrong, we'll just course correct. And yeah, we'll see what happens. If something comes up, then we'll fix it. So we didn't get planning permission for it. And then eventually the council came in and said, hey, this isn't the gym, so you're going to have to apply for planning permission. Now, we delayed it for about a year, and then eventually we got it. But by this stage, we were like, right, we're a few years deep now. There's no way we're going to stay in this facility. We've outgrown it. There's just too many things that are limiting our capabilities. So we decided to open up a second facility then, which was not too far from our current location. And there was a lot of mistakes made there as well. We didn't do our due diligence on the location. Eventually we would be told to leave after a couple of years, and it was getting knocked down as well. So we had invested I think we borrowed like 14 grand to go and invest in the facility to get it into some sort of order. And then a couple of years in, okay, this building's getting knocked down. The landlord had gone bust. He sold the building. It's actually demolished now. So there was a lot of lessons learned there as well. And we actually outstayed our welcome there also. So I remember the estate agents walked in and they just handed us a letter and were like, here's your eviction notice. And I was like, what? What's going on? Like, we're only in. And they were like, oh no, here, you have to get out. This building's going to be demolished. So we outstayed our welcome. Like, we were literally clinging on until we eventually found our third facility, and the facility that we're in currently, which is 5,000 square foot, again, not too far from our other locations. And it was a facility that I knew 15 years ago I was going to turn into a gym someday. So I actually had a visual that I was going to turn this place into a gym, and I had considered it before I moved into our second location, but just got a little bit scared because of the size of it and everything like that. But everything just fell into place. You know, everything happens for a reason. And for some reason, we were supposed to learn the lessons from the second location. And then we got into the third. And now, not only do we run the gym from it, but we've also got the academy. And as you said earlier on, I also do some consultancy. And now I'm in the events space as well. So that's all of this. Like, I have no idea how I got to this stage. It was just a constant refinement, constant course correction, constant fixing mistakes that were made, constant learning, constant investing in ourselves, hiring coaches, hiring mentors, just work.
I can sense you just listened. And as a fighter, you have to learn to listen. Don't get me wrong, there are some fighters that have such innate talent, they won't listen. They'll get to a certain level and then they reach that breaking point, and then they'll either leave the sport or they listen eventually. You listened to every single point. Okay, well, what can we do here? Well, we're outgrowing this. So what about this? We've outgrown that. What about this? Oh, we didn't do this. Okay, let me listen to that. And I can sense there's just a great listener that has picked up on these, listened to the needs of clients, of your facility, I do believe businesses are like organisms, and you've cultivated this organism that's got you there. and it's incredible.
Yeah. I think for me, for me personally, I like to say to people that being coachable is my superpower. And for me, at, at least, I think one of the most important skill sets that any coach could have is to be coachable themselves. If you're going to be a leader, well, then you have to be someone who can follow to begin with. I think that's one of the most important. I think that's the most important skill set for any coach is being coachable and being open to feedback and applying the lessons that you learned. Like if you don't do that and you continue to make the mistakes that you've made before, I think it's
Well,
unforgivable.
the best leaders, and I've been really lucky to coach a series of different leaders across the fitness industry, but also in even in the business world, whether that's CEOs or companies of over 5,000 people. Being in Dubai, you pick up some really interesting private clients sometimes. One guy was worth $10 billion. Another one had scaled his team from 180 people to 1,800 people within 14 months. But all of these leaders are
Wow.
still students. All of these leaders still decided
Mm.
to come and work with me and go, well, I've not looked too much into the men's performance game. I haven't really looked too much into my mindset, or I have, but I know there's more for me to learn. So I believe that point about being coachable is so important. I still have two mindset coaches that keep an eye on me. I still have mentors. I still have, my own coach, fitness coach. I still have all of these things because the top leaders are always students. And in my opinion, we're all standing on the shoulder of giants, and you get to pick those giants who you want to go and stand on their shoulders. And if you can do that, you're just consistently iterating and learning and growing and moving forward. So I totally agree with you. So a lot of people will see you and go, well, he's just sort of figured out as he's gone. But they'll probably assume that you're okay and you've just been confident and it's been easy. But if you wouldn't mind sharing, what would you say some of the more emotional challenges, whether that's self doubt, whether that's stress, whether that's anxiety or comparison? Because a lot of us put on this sort of front and we all think, oh, we don't suffer from all of those things. On the previous podcast, I talked about my experiences of not feeling enough as a fighter, or then going into business and not feeling enough there and trying to prove myself through money and realizing that wasn't the answer. I've gone a lot into that, so I'd love to learn more about you and how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me personally, I think the biggest emotional driver, several of them. I mean, I don't think anyone can honestly say that they can run a business and not feel some sort of anxiousness about waking up the next day. Like I have had days where I just haven't wanted to get up out of bed at all. Like just no, I'm not doing this today. I'm staying in bed. It's just not an option. So there's been days like that. And I think the biggest emotional driver has probably been fear for me personally. Now, again, this is a weird one, and I know people would say the fear can be a negative emotion, and it can be ego driven in a way. But again, for me, having come from a fighter's background, you're kind of living in fear all of the time. So it wasn't necessarily, I didn't see it as a bad thing. It was an emotional driver. And I think it still is today, fear of failure, fear of not winning. But at the same time, I don't think it's something that I would allow to limit me. And I think if you can control it and understand that everyone feels it and it's a completely normal part of life, well, then it just gives you that little bit of comfort. And yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest emotional drivers. And so for me, again, I love sharing this story with people. I think, and I always say to people, everything happens for a reason. One of the biggest reasons for my fear of failure, and this is like something else. Whenever I went to work in my father's pub, so I quickly, whenever I left school, I quickly developed into a leadership position within the place. Like I don't take orders well. I do take orders well, but in that perspective, I feel like if I can step up to a certain position, then I generally will take the lead on it, I should say. So I done that very quickly, and at a young age, I was given a leadership position. Now, I actually we lost a team member. He got into a fight outside the pub one night. He was actually out. He wa- and he was working in my place, so I asked him to work for me that evening. And then he went out for a few drinks after work, and he was on his way home. And there was a taxi depot next door to the pub, and he got into a bit of an argument, fell and hit his head, and he lost his life. Now he was in his 40s, and I that was the catalyst for me then getting out of that industry and moving into fitness. So for me, that being the catalyst and that being such a traumatic moment probably drove my fear of failure, because I had seen one side of humanity which was complete darkness. Right? I've seen the dark side of human nature, and I was like, this can't be the way. This can't be the way for me to have an impact on the world in this industry, in this nature, and this can't be the environment for me. So my fear of failure was driven from that, and then I took that and I applied that to my fitness business. And for me, I genuinely feel like the fitness industry is the most rewarding industry in the world. I suppose any personal development industry can be, because you get to see the good side of human nature. So for me, that was like that was always the main thing, and that was the main driver. So even though I did have a fear of failure, I also had a good perception of what I was doing. And even if I did fail, at least I was failing at something that was impactful to people and that was changing people's lives. And then that made it okay. And do you want to know something else that's absolutely amazing about this story? So the guy who we lost, his name is Joe O'Neill. I think he was about 40, about 47 at the time, if my memory serves me correctly. And I went to his funeral, obviously, and he had two young children. He had more children back in Scotland, but he had two young children living in Belfast. And I went to his funeral, and obviously it was a sad time. And for me, I had a lot of, uh, I mean, I was battling with it emotionally. Like, it was a real emotional experience for me, because obviously he was covering my shift, and I felt a lot of responsibility towards my team, and I took a lot of responsibility on as a leader. And I seen his two young children at his funeral, and I was like, okay, this is where it changes for me. This is it. I'm done. I can't see another family impacted like that. I can't be in this type of environment, in this type of mental state. And that then drove me to make the decision. Now, fast forward 9 years, I am coaching a group of students in my facility. And whenever our students come in, the very first thing that I get them to do is I get them to do hard shit. I get them to do a bit of public speaking, because I genuinely think that public speaking for a lot of people can be quite difficult. So that's the first thing that I do. I just throw them in at the deep end, and we're in the process of that. And there's a group of about 20 odd students there, and this young lad gets up and he starts to tell his story, and he tells a story about how he lost his father not too far from where we were sitting currently. And then he says his father's name, and lo and behold, 9 years since I seen this young lad, maybe a wee bit more. It was the same young lad whose father we buried that day, and I seen him at his funeral, and who I made the decision. It was because of these kids that I made the decision to go and do what I was wanted to do. And now, all of these years later, he ends up in my facility, setting out on the same journey that I set out on because of him. And he's still in the fitness industry today, and he's still impacting lives, which is absolutely unbelievable. And as I say,
It's
everything
giving me
happens for a
goosebumps.
reason.
It really does. And you kind of have to surrender to the universe and go, well, it is what it is. Good old boxing phrase. It is what it is. And how many times did you
It is
get
what it
that?
is. Yeah.
One tournament I turned up to, everybody at my weight dropped out apart from one guy. It was a guy called Ronald Sirigo, who was a world number 4, and he'd had like 194 or 204 fights, won quite a lot, went to the Beijing Olympics. And I decided not to drop out. I had about 30 fights, and I'm on Swedish national television in the final. He's Ugandan, but on the Swedish national team. And I just remember looking at my coach, and he just went, "It is what it is." And that phrase always comes back. It is what it is. That's such a beautiful, beautiful circle of life,
Okay.
so to speak. And I think when you just surrender to all of it,
Oh man.
like everything does happen for a reason, and you just got to trust in yourself. You got to trust in the process, and it'll all come good. It'll all come good. Oh, one
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. And that still drives me today, dude. The fact that yeah, it just made so much sense.
Yeah,
Life just made so much sense at that time. The
it
fact
just
that came
struck you to the
around
core. You
again,
just knew
I was
where I
like,
need you need to be. That's so incredible.
yeah, I'm exactly where I should be, and I think that's true for everyone, for all of your listeners, for anyone. You're exactly where you need to be right now, and the lessons that you're being given on a daily basis,
100%.
they're for a
I can
reason.
see why Ben said we had to speak to each other. I've loved this conversation, mate. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been an honor. I've got
Yeah,
one
likewise, man.
final question.
Likewise.
So forget about total mental performance or TMP as an organization, as an entity, or what we deliver, but think about the phrase total mental performance. If you had total mental performance, how would you know?
How would I know? Can
Work away.
can I curse on this podcast? Because I wouldn't give a fuck about outside circumstances. And I think that's generally how I operate. I feel like most of the time, I think I would be telling lies if there were moments where I said that maybe I didn't care what someone thinks, or I didn't care about the outside world. But there are times when that might be the case. But I think the vast majority of the time, I don't give a fuck what people say. Like, I really don't care what people say or think about me. If unless I'm asking the individual for feedback, unless it's someone that matters to me, then I care. I'm like, okay, well, I want to know what this individual thinks. I'm asking for feedback, but aside from that, I don't care. Total mental performance. When I think generally when I'm being active, when I'm being healthy, like there's nothing that anyone else could do that would impact my life in any way, shape, or form in a negative way. And I think for me, that's what total mental performance is. And I think the only way that you can achieve that is by looking at yourself, first of all, and making sure that how you're showing up for yourself is an 11 out of 10. How you're managing your own habits is on point. And I think when you do that, well, then there's nothing in the outside world that can impact your state, and you just generally you're going through life and you just realize that everything's okay.
Love
And
it, mate.
again, I think that just
Absolutely
comes
love it.
down to
Anyone that's
perspective.
listening to this, where can they find you?
You can find me at M_J_Lennon on Instagram, or ECA_Belfast on Instagram, or ECA_Belfast Gym on Instagram. So we got a lot going on there. Yeah, probably Instagram is the best place to connect with
Absolutely,
me.
mate. I've absolutely loved
Thank you
it.
for having me
We'll
on here,
stick
man.
all the links into the description of this podcast. But mate, it's been an honor. Thank you ever so much. And anybody that's listening, drop us some feedback, drop us some reviews, drop us some comments on the post that will go out. And yeah, mate, once again, thank you.